This is Bessie, one of the earliest visitorians, actually standing in the hallway of Bronte Parsonage, savouring the moment, that glorious moment when she actually got inside the literary shrine. You can see she can't believe her luck, and she stands there, solemnly vowing never, ever, ever to forget this glorious moment. It's thanks, of course, to Bessie and persistent early visitorians like her, who all read Mrs. Gaskell's Life of Charlotte Bronte and came to Haworth determined to see for themselves where the famous sisters lived and died and wrote their novels. This is one of the most extraordinary rooms in the parsonage. It's the first room that visitors encounter. It is the room that for 40 years the Brontes lived in Haworth was the father's study. It's where the notorious dyspeptic ate his meals alone, wrote his sermons that he preached on Sundays in the church he could see beyond the window. Early visitors who clamoured to get in would occasionally be invited in here and shown Bronte treasures. He would show them his John Martin prints that he was so proud of, that had so fired the imagination of the young Brontes. Evocations of light and dark that in some ways prefigure photography and the capturing of sunlight down a lens. Note the music on the piano that Charlotte Bronte could have purchased in London when she went to visit the zoo to see the newly arrived hippo. Perhaps she brought it back to put on Emily's piano, that was now silent, of course, because Emily had died the year before. Once the museum owned 5 other pianos that were all said to have belonged to the Brontes. Quite how 5 pianos could have fitted into this house, no one has ever explained, but also nobody knows what happened to them. This is Lucy, one of the sharp-nosed, eager visitorians, who's very happy that she's come with her furry muff because it's so cold in here, and how happy she is to be sitting in Patrick Bronte's study, looking at all his treasures. This is the dining room that was actually more of a general parlour where the family gathered. Here the sisters scribbled their novels and then walked round and round the table, reading them aloud to each other. I mean, fantastic. This is the room that witnessed the reading of Wuthering Heights before anybody else ever saw the book. This is the room where Emily Bronte died on that horsehair sofa, refusing to acknowledge that she was ill and letting a comb that she was using to tidy her hair fall into the fire. Burnt combs were once routinely flogged to visitors to Haworth as souvenirs, and you can see a pretty silver and bone comb on the table. There's another theory that Emily Bronte was combing the dog, and Keeper was so upset at how ill his mistress was that he nuzzled her hand, and the comb that she was using to brush him with fell into the fire. This is the room where the sole surviving sister Charlotte entertained guests, including, of course, Mrs. Gaskell. And you can see the sharp-beaked biographer conversing with the authoress. They're sitting underneath the portrait drawn by George Richmond that, together with the picture of Thackeray and Wellington here in this room, were gifts from another George Smith, her publisher in London. He was 7 years younger than Charlotte, and she had a bit of a crush on him. This probably isn't surprising because of all these presents that he kept sending. This tiny kitchen is just a token of a kitchen for visitors to see. In the Brontes' day, there was a double-storey utility area at the back of the house with an enormous chimney, presumably for an enormous stove, and thankfully a few water closets. This is the room where, of course, Tabby, who worked for the family for 30 years and who died just before Charlotte Bronte, would have prepared the food. Emily Bronte was famous for making puddings and bread, and she would have been in here stirring her puddings with Keeper, the great dog that was absolutely devoted to her. Keeper and Tabby had a cat and dog relationship. Tabby hated the way he would take himself upstairs and lounge on her starched white sheets. And one day she famously told Emily that she wasn't standing for it anymore. She came downstairs and said that Keeper was up on the beds, and Emily went upstairs and dragged him down and beat the hell out of him. And he devoted himself to Emily for the rest of her life, and when she died, he followed her coffin, and then he used to sit outside her door. And this is Arthur Bell Nicholls' study. Visitorians are firmly divided over Arthur Bell Nicholls, of course. Some say that Charlotte only married her father's dull curate on the rebound, when her publisher married a pretty young woman. She wrote him a curt one-liner, then almost immediately announced her own engagement. Others say that Arthur Bell Nicholls is the real hero of the Bronte story. Apart from supplying the sisters' pseudonym, Bell, because they were Currer Bell, Ellis Bell, Acton Bell, and they took his name as a joke, the poor man waited years and years for Charlotte, genuinely loved her, and when he eventually won her, he proved his worth. Their honeymoon in Ireland was probably the most carefree time of her life. She appears to have been happy for the 9 months before she died in pregnancy, and he then stayed here and cared for her rather difficult father with great devotion, even taking the Reverend Patrick's dogs back to Ireland with him when Haworth got rid of him. This is the old storeroom Charlotte tricked out in Irish green for him, and here you can see a typical curate's desk full of treasures that have all been lost. This is the desk of the missing stuff. If all the objects associated with the Brontes were miraculously returned to the parsonage, visitors could scarcely get through the front door to see them. This is the children's study. This tiny room was where the Bronte children hid away reading newspapers and writing stories. It was here that they famously divided out a set of wooden soldiers that Papa had brought back from Leeds. And this was the start of all their literary endeavours. They had other toys too, including Headless Henry, the history of a little boy published in 1810. The child could become a beggarman or an admiral, or something in between. It's quite significant that they would have been able to cut out heads and put them on the bodies. There's also a tea plate here that Charlotte Bronte is said to have owned, and although some visitorians suspect it is only associated with the Brontes because it depicts 3 sisters taking tea, they've naturally demanded their own version of the plate. The one on display was owned by Bessie, who we saw downstairs in the hallway, who told her friends that Arthur Bell Nicholls himself had given it to her and that she had eaten a slice of plum cake off it. Anyway, it's been very kindly donated to the museum, the Visitorian Museum, by her great niece, Miss Bertha Lewis, who now lives in Canada.